So, gentlemen, good to see you. Thanks so much for coming. Obviously, everybody who's seen the show knows that you believe Stephen Avery was not guilty and that the prosecution did meet its burden, but not guilty doesn't mean innocent. Are you convinced, Dean, that Stephen Avery is innocent?
I'm convinced that's the wrong question. I have my own personal view, which really doesn't matter in the end, that he probably is innocent, but the real question is whether he was proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the question we need to ask down here on earth with the uncertainty we deal with, and I'm convinced that the prosecution didn't meet that burden.
Will I do any better with you with that question, Jerry, or no? Okay, well, let's talk about the central theme, the police misconduct thing. You both contend that it was intentional. In the sense I got, tell me if this is a wrong characterization, is they decided what the outcome was to be, the guilt of Stephen Avery, that he had done it, and they cooked the evidence to get there. But the sense I got from you, Dean, well, I think you used a term, maybe it was in your closing or something, that they didn't act with malice, that essentially, well, I think you used those words. Is that not an accurate retelling? What did you mean when you said that? And you said a similar sort of thing, Jerry.
I don't remember saying a similar sort of thing, other than that, you know, there were two officers that were primarily, we thought the evidence pointed primarily to them being involved with tampering or planting of the evidence. The others may well have gone along because of the belief that they didn't have a malice, but they thought that they were simply augmenting the state's case. That's maybe what.
You know what I meant by that? What I meant by that is that when the police are tempted to augment a case dishonestly, whether planting evidence, slanting a police report, a little bit of lying on the witness stand, when they're tempted to do that, almost always it's because they really believe the person guilty, as a hunch, as just a belief. They may or may not be right about that. I think it's very rare for the police to say, I know this guy is innocent or I believe he's innocent, but I'm going to frame him anyway.
But when I sit on my couch, you had to control your rage, and I assume you've felt it at times. We didn't have to control our rage at home. There were many times when I said, why don't they believe that these two cops may have been involved in some fashion in either the murder or the disposal of the body? You seem not to think that. Was that a strategic decision, or you actually believe in your heart that all they did is cook the evidence?
I actually believe that they were not involved in the murder. That's just a bridge too far for me. I think whoever killed this young woman understood full well that suspicion would fall immediately on Stephen Avery and took advantage of that. And indeed, the police did focus immediately and essentially exclusively on Stephen Avery.
Do you buy that notion, Jerry?
Well, yeah, see, the problem was because we were not allowed to point the finger at anybody else as another suspect, it opened the door for the state to make that argument that they must be saying that the police are the ones that killed her and burned her, because who else? And that was never our pretrial theory that we wanted to advance. You know, the evidence didn't really point in that direction so much as it did in other directions that the jury never heard about.
Could you explain what in Wisconsin law precluded you, or what decision the judge, why were you precluded from suggesting that it was likely, or whatever the term of art is, that somebody else was more responsible or was responsible for this instead of your client?
There's a rule of law that basically says you can't just try and, confuse the jury by, blowing smoke about somebody else unless there's some legitimate tendency or connection of that person to the crime. And typically that would mean access, opportunity, or motive. But in this case, the judge layered all of them on and required us to prove. We had a number of people that we thought had plenty of access, people that there was no alibi for, investigative leads that they never followed. But because we were not able to prove that any of these individuals had a motive to kill her, we were denied an opportunity to present that evidence, even though the state did not have to and did not prove any motive on the part of Mr. Avery.
Yeah, I have to say, that was related to that. So you have to demonstrate by whatever standard, if you want to implicate is probably the wrong choice of words, but at least suggest somebody else did it, that there was a motive for that person. But the state in Wisconsin has no obligation to prove that Stephen Avery or his nephew had a motive to do what they did?
Right.
Go ahead.
Legislature didn't set up that rule. And in fact,
That's judicial thing?
Judge
That was
made,
judicial.
in this case, in fact, it was never that clear that all of those layers were required until this case. And then when the Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction, it now became law. It's not, it doesn't have to be that way. The legislature could change it if they want in Wisconsin or any other place.
it's always been true in Wisconsin, and it's true in most states, that the prosecution doesn't have to prove motive, the reason why. They have to prove intent, but not the reason why. What's new in Wisconsin is that the defense does have to prove motive if you want to point to an alternate suspect.
Yeah, staying on killers, and obviously by definition, if Stephen Avery didn't do it, somebody else did. You weren't able to introduce evidences to other possibilities. Do you think you know, Dean, who was responsible, who was likely responsible here?
We had identified 8 people who had opportunity to do this and some legitimate tendency based on their past and their conduct at the time. We'd identified 8. We probably would have narrowed it down just for the sake of clarity with the jury to, sort of the strongest suspects at the time.
You don't want to say who they are.
No, that's not fair at this point. It was excluded. I'm not in a courtroom.
Were any of those people we saw in the 10 weeks of making a murder?
The documents we filed in court are online that people can look at. But rather than commenting publicly about them now, we just don't think it's fair to do that.
Did you suggest at any point to the prosecution? The prosecution knew who these 8 people who you thought were likely people. Did they do anything to investigate anything that you sent in their direction that was not Stephen Avery connected?
Not that I know.
No.
Do you stay in touch with him?
With his family. Stephen is represented by new lawyers now, so we really can't communicate directly with him anymore because he has counsel. We're still in touch with his family. And over the years, the last 9 years, we've been in touch with Stephen on and off.
Until this new lawyer got
Until the new
involved in the
lawyer.
case. There are a couple. You guys, well, I think if America had to rate your performance, you get rave reviews. But there have been some questions or criticisms about something. One is, why don't you request a change in venue? If there's ever been a county in America who had it in for a defendant, it's this county. What are there, 70-some counties or something in your home state? Why wasn't there a request for a change of venue?
Because, people don't, looking back on it now who aren't from Wisconsin don't realize just how polluted the entire state was. I mean, this was a statewide phenomena. They got a death penalty referendum on the ballot for the first time as a result of this case, statewide, and it passed overwhelmingly. So it wasn't like you could go down to Milwaukee or Dane County. In fact, Brendan's trial came from Dane County, his jurors. Any place in the state had the same problem.
And the reason for that is 10 months before Stephen Avery's trial started, there were 2 successive, very powerful, inflammatory press conferences from the prosecution. Those ran in all 7 major media markets in Wisconsin and then echoed over and over and over for the following 10 months. So
Yeah,
sure.
but Dean, it seems to me from afar that when you'd hear testimony in the most serious criminal trial I'm sure that county's ever seen, and some people on the other side would refer to Stephen Avery by his first name. I mean, everybody knows everybody. It's this incredibly incestuous situation. So even if Jerry's point is a good one, that the whole state was infected by the publicity, 4 counties over or 5 counties over, there probably wasn't the same long-term feeling. Those Avery people are bad seeds. The whole family are criminals. Isn't there
There
something?
also wasn't the same awareness of the hostility that the sheriff's department locally had to the Avery family. That was the advantage of staying local, is they understood something of the nuances and the dynamic between the sheriff's department and
Keep in mind,
that family.
in Wisconsin, a defendant has a constitutional right to be tried in the venue where this occurred. Sure. There were times where, I think the prosecution probably would have been happy if we had moved it away. Maybe that was part of the motivation for the press conferences to begin with. I don't know. But, it was a difficult decision. It wasn't anything that we took lightly. And we don't think that decision, if different, really would have changed the outcome.
A criticism has been leveled at you by this new lawyer that you've mentioned. You've been very kind in response. She has suggested that you had cell phone records through discovery that would I don't know if she said would prove, but would demonstrate to some degree that the victim actually had made a phone call when driving away. She also talked about phone calls that allegedly were on this the victim's log the night before to somebody who was a convicted sex abuse or subsequently a sex abuse. Is there any merit to the criticism of that? I mean, she said there was actually ineffective counsel.
It's not that we're being kind in response to that. It's that we are defense lawyers and we understand exactly what she's doing and why she's doing it. This is what she should be doing, is looking critically at our performance and at everything else under
Do you
the
think you
sun
fell
in this
short on
case.
those counts, though, the ones she's raising?
I have no idea. I really have no idea. I know damn sure that I'm not a perfect lawyer, that I make mistakes, and if I made one here, I want to acknowledge it.
Jerry, why are you doing this tour? I mean, it's pretty rare to see defense lawyers going around the country, and as you said, you're not representing Stephen Avery now. Why are you guys doing this?
Because the things that are raised in this documentary, the things that seem to outrage people and the questions that we've gotten are things that Dean and I have talked about for years.
Like what?
Well, I mean, there's a questioning of juveniles, interrogation techniques that are used, the inadequate pay for criminal defenders, the jury selection procedures. There's a whole range of them that people want to focus on. We've talked about them, but most people haven't been interested in hearing about them until now. And when we saw the kinds of questions that were being asked of us by the media after the documentary came out, and then saw the 2 or 3 minutes that was on the TV nightly news, it was the same thing that we saw before trial. And Dean and I talked about it. We said, it'd be good if we could use some of this interest in a forum and get people talking about what changes they might be able to make to their own system.
How come you're so optimistic, though? I've read both of your interviews, optimistic about change because of the Margaret Marshall, former Chief Justice of the SJC, was on with me last week. Her husband, of course, wrote the famous Gideon's Trumpet about the case that established a right to trial for certain criminal defendants. You read the story in the New York Times a few weeks ago. There's a woman in some county or district in Louisiana who's the only public defender, even though every defendant is entitled to, if they're indigent, to a criminal. So how is it that you maintain the level of optimism in this environment where all these defendants are sort of them to the American people? They're not us, they're them. How do you stay optimistic, Dean?
Look, you either keep trying or you quit. If you quit, nothing's going to get better. They're not going to stop arresting poor people and prosecuting them. So, you can try or you can die, but it seems to me the better choice is to try. And much as, the human frailty infects every aspect of the criminal justice system, so human dignity also infuses every aspect of this. And I believe that. And I believe we can do better tomorrow than we've done yesterday.
The other issue you raised beyond poor people, a certain two-tiered, three-tiered level of justice, police misconduct thing. The history shows in this country, as you guys saw there, you can prove the most grotesque level of police misconduct, and if they get a slap on the hand, that's a lot. I mean, there was our partner, New England Center on Investigative Reporting, just did a study demonstrating that in almost all these cases.
Right, but people aren't accepting that anymore. Now that
because of Chicago and Baltimore and Ferguson.
The cell phone videos that people now see in captured on film, where before the police would have said, "Oh, he struggled over the gun and it was accidental and all that." Now they're seeing something that's very different and very troubling, and people are not going to take it anymore. I mean, we have people marching out and shutting down freeways. And it's the first time in my life that I've heard criminal justice reform as part of a presidential debate. And I just saw yesterday's paper, I think it was, that President Obama was meeting with rappers to see what he could do, and through them to help improve the system of justice we have in this country. So as difficult as it is to be optimistic, there's at least some potential change in the wind.
I'm glad you guys are. I really am glad you're. Just a couple of more things quickly, gentlemen. Let's get back to Avery for a minute. What I gather from watching you in the final episode, new evidence is realistically the only hope this guy has if he's not to die in jail. Is that most likely to happen around, I mean, for everybody who watched the blood that was taken during the original crime for which he was exonerated, you demonstrated with joy that there was a hole in that thing, and that ultimately at trial, they were able to prove to the satisfaction apparently of the jury that the blood that was discovered in the victim's car was not from there because it was not tainted by some chemical preservative. But you guys in the trial suggested that the reason you couldn't prove that it was from there was because the technology was not yet where it needs to be. Is it getting closer, Dean?
I think it may be getting closer, and this is going to sound like exaggeration, but it's not. The great benefit that this movie has done for Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey is it's harnessed 100,000 motivated minds who are thinking about technological advance, tests that might be done now, or could have been done then and weren't, and things beyond the scientific evidence. Now, how much of that in the end will pay off for Stephen's new legal team, I don't know, but there's a lot of people thinking and trying to offer their help.
What's the moral of the story, Jerry?
The moral of which of
This whole story that all of America was.
The people need to wake up. They need to see what happens in their courthouses. They need to take ownership of them, because the reason things like this go on, you know, the sheriff in Manitowoc had been elected many times. The prosecutors, I mean, these people are elected. The judges are elected, and the way they get away with behaving the way you see on film, and the things that they say are the things that they said, is because nobody holds them accountable. The elections are sort of an insider's game in the courthouse. People don't turn out and vote for that. So, but a lot of it is because people didn't really know that this sort of thing goes on. I mean, isolated when it happens to their family. How can this be? How could they take my son out of class without calling me and do this to him? But now we have a much broader awareness of that, and that's the reason. One reason for optimism, I think, is that people really do need to know what goes on in the courthouse. This is where people intersect with their courts more than any other area, is in criminal charges. Not always serious like this, but some sort of criminal court.
So lastly, you think the obsession with the show is because people do want to see justice delivered, not just a fun television show that they all enjoyed because of the suspense?
I really do think the thirst for justice is universal. We define it differently, we understand it differently, but we all want justice. And there is a history of grassroots effort making real change in the legal system. One example that comes to mind, for decades, in rape cases where consent was the defense lawyers were standing up and cross-examining complaining witnesses about how short their skirt was, or their manner of dress, or what they were doing on a dance floor. And people at some point said, we've had enough of that. And you know what? The culture changed, and the rules of evidence changed to limit that kind of inquiry and focus it more on the relevant rather than just sort of besmirching a complaining witness's reputation. And it's possible to make change. It doesn't happen overnight. With grassroots effort, though, it's really possible to make change in the long term.
Well, you won this case. I'm more optimistic after 15 minutes than I was at the beginning. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Dean, good to see you.
Thanks, Jim.
Jerry, thank you so much for your time.